thank you all so much for joining me for this conversation this afternoon. My name's Tom, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Start Some Good, and also the host these days of the Think Act Change events. I want to acknowledge that this event series was originally founded by my good friend Avis Mulhall, who some of you may know from back in the day. She then moved overseas. This group went dormant for a while, and I kind of picked it up and have run with it on and off for the last couple of years. I'm very grateful to have been able to kick off this new series this year in an online format, thanks to the support of our partner, the Darling Square Community Bank. And it was really good of you. We were just about to kick off a new series of events in Darling Square with the Darling Square Community Bank. And I'm very grateful that they were willing to kind of pivot and adapt with us into this new environment and sponsor an online series like this, despite they themselves being, of course, quite place-based. And so I want to particularly welcome anyone who's joining us from that part of Sydney. That's the spiritual home of the Think Act Change event. And so I want to make a couple of acknowledgements. I'm actually personally at this moment located on the lower North Shore of Sydney. And so I want to acknowledge that the land that I'm joining you from is the land of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. But also want to acknowledge that the home of Think Act Change is Darling Square, and with our partners, the Darling Square Community Bank, and that's the traditional land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging from the other side of the harbour as well as pay my respects to all the traditions and stories represented by all of you and all of the land that you are joining us from. And if I pull up the chat, I'll be able to see some of that. Lots of people from Sydney, which is great, as well as Glebe, that's in the catchment, that's awesome. More or less, close enough. But also Canberra, Melbourne, Victoria, Poland, hello. That's awesome, Nate. Tasmania, Brisbane and elsewhere. So thank you for all of us for joining us. I think it really is, I think, one of the benefits of everything we've gone through this year is that it has enabled us to connect in new ways, and I guess has forced all of us to commit a bit to connecting in new ways across distance in these new formats. And I think that will be good. That will be a good experience. That will be a good muscle, and that we've all developed. That will hopefully help us, continue to innovate more effectively into the future. And that's really what this whole event series is about, is exploring some of the places, some of the emerging techniques, trends and approaches to creating change and to creating positive impact in a changing world. And of course, technology is absolutely crucial to that. And that's going to be the theme that we'll be exploring tonight. I'm going to kick off with just a short presentation setting the scene with some of, some of the things that I think are interesting and important. Then I'll be inviting Nick to give to share some thoughts on some of the trends, and I'll introduce him more effectively at that time. And then Nick will join the panel along with Andrew and Lily and Lucinda, who'll be joining us in a few moments. I think, yeah, to have a great conversation about a number of different areas where technology is progressing in ways that are exciting and inspiring and full of potential when it comes to the kind of social impacts that we want. And that'll also be a chance for all of you to tease out any questions that you've ever had about how people are leveraging mobile technology, blockchain, all sorts of different approaches, voice enabled devices to support people in new ways. So that'd be cool. So start thinking about your questions now. I want that to be heavily based on your questions, not just mine, because there's obviously a million different directions we could take that. But without further ado, let me share my screen and just run through a few thoughts that I have about this work. So hopefully you can all see that. Okay. So my name's Tom, and as I said, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Start Some Good. We began life as a crowdfunding platform, but these days do quite a diverse range offer quite a diverse range of platforms and programs, all of which those serve to try and inspire and support greater innovation for social change. And so we try and build pathways that link people from inspiration and helping people understand what's possible. And obviously this kind of event series fits in that space. We want to share kind of some of the exciting examples out there and opportunities and new ways of thinking and new approaches through to design with our Good Hustle social enterprise design course and the accelerator programs that we run on behalf of partners like Austral Fisheries and Optus and ING, through to launch and testing with our crowdfunding platform, and pitch event series, Pitch for Good, and then grow and sustain, which is some new work we're developing around a crowd lending platform, Lend for Good. And we've also recently launched an entrepreneurs community, the Starting Good Network, which is to help give people access to more learning sessions like this, as well as to peer-to-peer collective wisdom from other people who are going through the change-making journey and the social entrepreneurship journey. So I'd love you all to check that out in particular. I'll give that a shout out. That's at startsomegood.com/starting-good. If you'd like to join that community and be one of our founding members, and I'd love you all to do so. And so I've long been fascinated by how we leverage technology for social impact, and how we support other people to leverage technology for social impact as well. Prior to Start Some Good, I've been the first digital communications director at an organization called Ashoka in Washington, DC, where I'd explored how social technologies could support their mission of creating an everyone a change maker world. So how could we leverage social technologies and storytelling essentially to inspire as many people as possible, everyone, preferably, to get involved in creating change in whatever form worked for them. That could be as a founder or an entrepreneur, as a volunteer or a donor, as a conscious consumer or a conscious parent or an active community member. After that, I worked at a social change innovation lab in Silicon Valley called Hope Lab. And it was while I was working at Hope Lab that I came to found Start Some Good, somewhat to my surprise at the time, but because I was so inspired by and fascinated by what I was learning in that environment about what it meant to support innovation more effectively. And so my particular passion, of course, is innovation for the public good. And a big part of why we exist at Start Some Good and why I wanted to launch Start Some Good was I simply felt like there was too little support at those early stages for people who were trying to innovate for the public good, who were trying to, in other words, try new things that were not yet proven to work, because that's what innovation looks like. And the reason that that matters so much is that the world is just ever speeding up. And I think, God, this year has been yet another reminder of that. If we thought the pace of change in 2019 was already pretty extreme, 2020 was like, hold my beer. And so in a world, of course, that is filled with rapid change, it means that the things that were proven to work before cannot be expected to work tomorrow. That we can't rest on our laurels, even once we have discovered, meaningful ways of making a difference. We can't then stop and consider the job ever to be done. It's not enough that we simply kind of create, therefore it's not enough that we discover kind of individual ways that work. As a sector, as kind of an ecosystem, as people who care about change, we also need to develop kind of a muscle around innovation, the capacity to innovate for social good. Now, as I said, the world itself is speeding up, and you see that all around us, the growing number of us, the increasing connectedness, the ever accelerating growth of technology. And so this has created what I think of as the innovation imperative that I was describing before, that, it's no longer an option whether we innovate. Innovation is going to happen. It's whether we try and direct that in the directions that we want. It's whether we try and focus innovation around the social outcomes that we need. But the fact of the matter is innovation is hard. And I think kind of innovation for good might be, I think, actually the hardest category of innovation of all. Partly because there's simply less support for innovation for good than there is for innovation for profit at the moment. And partly that comes from a really good place, that a lot of the people who want to support work that is for the social good, tend to work and perhaps exist sometimes in a mindset that is fairly resource constrained. And we can therefore find ourselves focusing on, addressing symptoms rather than really addressing root causes, and focusing on essentially taking, preferencing the thing that's already proven to work, even if that thing is inadequate and not actually solving the problem, over the potential of the as yet unproven approach. But there are organizations that are stepping into this space and really exploring what's possible. I'm getting ahead of myself. So that's the big problem that we exist to work on, is how do we fund social innovation? Who's actually going to pay for and support and fund it, not just in the sense of direct funding transfers, but how do we resource innovation? How do we build infrastructure for social innovation? And while there's more and more that's happening, which is good, historically the answer is we mostly haven't. And that's because our sector is dominated by well-meaning people trying to do the best they can, but the best they can has too often come to mean the best that we can be certain is going to happen. And so if I have a range of ideas to choose amongst, what am I most confident and most convinced is definitely going to happen? And so there's a tendency to kind of systematically play small out of a perfectly reasonable, perfectly understandable, and perfectly kind of justifiable desire to avoid wasting money on not doing good. And so therefore focusing on, let's make sure that we can do good. But it's created this slightly, I think, at times limiting culture for social change that so many entrepreneurs are working to bust through, including everyone you're going to meet tonight. And I'm so excited to hear all of their perspectives on some of these topics. But it's created that challenge for people to actually get the support, to try new things, to develop, to collect the data that can then prove that works. And this is one of the things that really struck me when I moved to San Francisco and lived in San Francisco, was just the different questions that people asked. Because in San Francisco, and I think in much of the commercial startup world, it's really upside oriented, upside focused. And that means the core question that gets asked is, what could happen? What could happen if this worked? Maybe it won't work. It probably won't work. But if it did work, what could that mean for the world, for the company, for me, the investor? In the social sector, I think too often we default to this vastly more limiting question, which is what will happen? Write me an application and tell me what is going to happen with my money. And that's where the increasing focus on impact measurement is important, but can't be the only game in town. Because impact measurement is a what will happen. You know, that if I want to know that if I put in $100,000, exactly how many lives that's going to take. You know, show me a formula that for every $1,701 you receive, you're able to educate another person, and give me that exact formula and so on. And let's even if we can get that to a number, that would be great. And then I'm willing to invest. Now that's all very well and good, but of course, in order to get that number, you need to do a range of things that create impacts that you can measure. And so what we've been missing historically is this risk-tolerant capital that's prepared to pay for experiments, that's prepared to pay for finding out what works and what doesn't. And the only way you can do that, of course, is to accept that a big part of what you're paying for is to discover what won't work, because that's just part of the process. You can't just pick one without the other. And I think this is a trap, again, that people fall into, which is kind of wanting to have their cake and eat it too. I want innovation, but I want only proven innovation. I want safe innovation. And of course, someone has to pay for unsafe innovation, which is experiments. And the thing that I was really struck by in that culture in Silicon Valley, for all its flaws and for all that it's filled with people working on ridiculous, not very important problems and wasting huge amounts of human capacity and resources on, getting people to click on links at a slightly higher rate. For all of that, it's a very enabling culture when it comes to trying things out, because there's a range of resources put around that, both the work of individual angel investors, literally investing, but also accelerators, mentors, and a whole culture that constantly asks what could happen. And so this is kind of why we exist, to try and help fill this gap however we can. And a big part of, I think, the challenge here for socially minded investors of all sorts, whether that's philanthropy or impact investors or all of us as individuals, is this dynamic that I've observed over these kind of 9 years now that we've been helping people launch new ideas for social impact. And it's that good ideas look like good ideas. But I think a lot of the time, great ideas look like bad ideas. And that's because good ideas are more or less sensible. They build on the status quo. They don't challenge our assumptions about how the world works. They just extend it in a certain direction. Whereas a great idea, which we might define here as an idea that's capable of really changing the dynamic around a particular market or cause or community or social challenge, looks unlikely, sounds like it won't work, because it tends to challenge our assumptions. It tends to violate them in some ways because it wants to shift the system in some way. And therefore, people's first reaction is often to hear an idea like that and say, that'll never work. And the fact is, they're mostly right. Most of those ideas don't work. But tangled up with all those ideas that actually won't work are the brilliant ideas that could actually shift things. But the only way to differentiate them, the world is changing too fast today, the future is too unpredictable. So there's no way you can just look in that bucket of ideas and just select out the winners, just select out the actually great ideas. The only way you do that is by trying a lot of stuff. is by running experiments. And so when I'm feeling a little bit cheeky, I sometimes call this Dawkins's law, but perhaps for a friendlier and easier to share name might be the innovation paradox. The paradox that the innovations we most need seem the most unlikely to work and therefore attract the most skepticism. And so this is where I think it's great to see the work of organizations that are helping people across this gap. And I think that's why we're seeing an increasing interest by non-profit and social change organizations in investing in social enterprises and social startups that are leveraging technology and innovation to make a difference. Whether that's WWF with the Future Cities project, or the work that they've done with blockchain, and they've rolled out now a number of startups in that space, through to CPA supporting the Remarkable Accelerator, or Optus with the Future Makers Accelerator, which I should have had a picture of that. I don't know why I've included Remarkable and not Future Makers. We run Future Makers with Optus, and we have we have one of the teams from Future Makers with us today, which is Andrew from Maslow. Or another accelerator that we've been running this year, Seafood for Good, with Austral Fisheries. And they've partnered with WWF to roll out many of these transparency technologies. And so what a lot of these technologies respond to, we've also seen, of course, a lot of work in this area through our crowdfunding platform over the years, whether it's, clean technologies to child orthotics and 3D print, leveraging 3D printing and scanning, through to lots of cool apps of all different sorts. And we'll hear about one of those today as well. What a lot of these are responding to is I think the other thing that is shifting along with the pace of change, which is our relationship with change. And so I just want to touch on that before I hand over the mic just for a minute. Because I think this interesting thing has happened with the ever accelerating pace of change, which is where that can feel overwhelming when you kind of step back and see it in aggregate. I actually think simultaneously it's really empowering to individuals, because while change has accelerated, it's also been demystified. Now everything changes all the time. And so change is just kind of the sea that we swim in. It wasn't so long ago where people actually didn't think that you could change anything. People didn't actually fundamentally believe in change, because things didn't change very much on the course of a lifetime. And so the kind of basic idea was that, change was this thing that happened to us, not through us. Change was, was things that was created by kings and revolutionaries and prophets and maybe, inventors here or there. But as change has kind of ever accelerated, it's in some ways become something that's within each of our grasps now, because we know now that change is also shifts in technology, changes in product, changes in culture, changes in what issues are on in general, what aren't, things that actually we do interact with and have a kind of influence on. And so I think this has driven this whole different kind of approach to change making that I call the shift from legacy to alignment. Whereas we used to see, and you still hear this from older generations. Like, I'm on a couple of not-for-profit boards, and I'm still, shamefully the youngest person on at least one of those. And it's filled with, the people that you find on serious not-for-profit boards, all great people, but there's several very accomplished business executives there, as you'll often find. And you ask them, why did you decide to get involved? Why did you decide to join this board? And they say was more or less always to the effect of, I've done pretty well in my career, and I realized it was time to give back. And this idea of a time to give back is itself a very old school idea that is disappearing almost entirely below a certain age, because that's still that idea that you kind of do whatever you got to do for, until you have accrued enough personal wealth or influence or authority or success. And then it's time to turn your attention to other issues like the wider community, the environment, or whatever the case might be. And generally younger people just reject that. It's something they think about day to day, not in terms of like, what decade am I up to? And is it the time to give back decade? But rather, what am I doing today? And how can I make sure that aligns with my values? And so this is what's driving a lot of the business for good movement, is people who need products that allow them to live in alignment with their values. This is what's driving a lot of innovation around product design, circular economies, and all sorts of things in this space, because people want to be able to solve their personal needs for sure, but do so in a way that's aligned with their values. And it's because we now know that it's not just that the future is not just shaped by other people's decisions, but by ours as well. So we think about those decisions in terms of our values, not just our consumption, but who we choose to work for. It's why it doesn't say right here, but this is Donors Choose, if anyone's curious, who are an awesome tech for good startup. They're not for profit, but they're very much a startup. 1,000 people have applied to be their receptionists because they were so inspired to be part of that mission. Deloitte have chosen that alignment with purpose is the number one thing that keeps the number one difference between graduates who leave in under 2 years versus those who stay in over 5 years. Kind of survey after survey, report after report is showing increasingly that people are factoring for social when they're thinking about which businesses they purchase from or support, and have just a much higher expectation of brands and how they have to align with those social purposes. And in an interconnected world, this makes a huge difference, not just philosophically, but practically as well, in how things spread, in what ideas spread and what businesses succeed. None of which makes it easy, but all of which are trends that are serving to help fuel some of the Tech for Good movement. It's still challenging, and that's where I want to really get, where I'm so excited to move to the panel conversation in a few more minutes, to really dive into 4 entrepreneurs who are leveraging technology for good, how they're making progress, how they're introducing their new ideas, finding the support they need, and making a difference. But before we get to that, I want to invite, I'll stop sharing this, Nick Byrne, who's one of our guests, is going to give a short presentation before we move onto the panel discussion. Nick's the co-founder and I think director, right? Not CEO of Typehuman, which is a public interest technology studio. And so they partner with not-for-profits, foundations, governments, and companies to explore this exact question of how to leverage technology for social impact. And so I invited Nick to share a few of his kind of scene-setting thoughts before we move into the panel discussion. Thanks, Nick. Do you need to share your screen? Are you able to do that?
Yeah, I'll do that in just a tick, but I'll say thanks for having me. Acknowledge the traditional owners that I'm sitting on today, and I have to embarrassingly admit that I haven't done my research, but it's certainly no lack of respect still. Also, just thanks, Tom, for having me. I feel like our paths seem to cross far too infrequently these days, but every time I hear you speak...
almost annually.
Annually, there seems to be an annual cycle, that's right.
Yeah.
But I'm always really warmed by the words that you share. I think there's always such strength in the messages that you're offering, and we should listen to you more often.
Thanks, Nick. You should. Some people probably think they hear me say the same stuff far too often.
Right, maybe that's why. Keep it as an annual check-in, otherwise
keep it fresh. Yeah.
And also just wanted to acknowledge Lucinda, who will be on the panel as well, as another peer, or somebody I consider a peer, who our paths seem to come in and out. But there's certainly been some recurring faces in this for good tech for good space in Australia, and it's nice to see a bit of a cohort forming. And not to take anything away from our other panelists, who I look forward to meeting shortly as well. So I'll share my screen and throw up a few thoughts to help encourage some conversation. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that. Can I get a thumbs up? Yep, cool. I will call on some audience participation at some point through this talk as well. So if you've got your mute button handy or a thumbs up button, please have your finger on it. You'll be able to make fun of some tech spam soon. So in preparing for tonight's conversation, the questions seem to be what next. So I've broken up my very short presentation into 2 parts. The first part is summarizing how we've come to understand this kind of craziness that we've found ourselves in. And thankfully, we'd done some research a couple of years ago that helped us at least form our own theory and view on what the hell is going on and what place does technology play in all of this. And then the second half is I'll just go through some case studies of some interesting tech for good projects that we've been involved with, not so much as blowing our own horn, but I genuinely think they're interesting applications of technology that, as you'll see, I think people are rolling their eyes at. I suggested to Tom that I wasn't going to talk about blockchain as much tonight, but when I've looked back over everything, Tom, I think that's where I landed. So in answering this question around what next, we've come to this view that believe it or not, we're moving into this new lifestyle and economic environment. And I guess we're probably all more convinced of that due to COVID, but the last time I spoke about this was pre-COVID, and people were less convinced of that. But the reason why we're so convinced of that is rooted in some research that we've come across by economist Carlota Perez. She's a South American economist who works out of UCL and LSE. And she wrote this book in 2002 called Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital. And it certainly looks and reads as if it's a textbook from university. But if you can break through that, there's some fantastic historical analysis in there that she's done to help us understand our current, our present and our future, sort of rooted in the historical cycles that we've moved through in the past. And it's been really nice to see her do more and more speaking circuits over the last several years in particular, because a lot of her predictions and commentary in this book is really coming to life now. So you're seeing a lot of her talks, just becoming increasingly relevant. Has anybody come across her work before? His first opportunity to click some buttons or nod your heads? No? Cool. Always nice to, I feel like in very near future, everybody's going to know her. She's going to be a rock star and I'm going to seem like I'm a fanboy just jumping on the bandwagon. So the key premise of her work is that when we look back over the last 300 to 400 years, we see some clear patterns around how technologies are discovered, how they propagate through society, and how they effectively interact with capitalism. And so she studied these 5 different technological revolutions that are on the screen here, starting with the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s, moving to the steam and railways period, to the steel and electricity and heavy engineering period, automobiles, oil and mass production, which is, in her words, the mess we're solving now. And the current paradigm that we're halfway along is the information and telecommunications revolution. And that started in the 1970s with the birth of the microprocessor. And the dynamics of these revolutions is what's really interesting to us, given where we stand in 2020. Because the first half of these revolutions are characterized by what's called an installation period. So this is the beginning of these installation periods. We discover a new technology, investors put money into it, and then they get really addicted to returns on their investment, basically. So if you can imagine being an investor in Intel or Apple in the early 70s and 80s, that initial investment that they made in these companies generated 10, 20 times return. And so because of that return in the early phase of this installation period, what we see happen is about halfway along, the real economy splits from this, capital splits from the real economy, and we end up with a speculative economy. Carlota Perez describes it as a casino economy. We see asset bubbles, investors tripping over themselves to just make more money, and not really a whole lot of investment back into the real world. So historically, at least, the way that the installation period ends by an economic collapse. And that's in some ways necessary to reset the expectation of capital so that we can move away from a speculative economy and start to invest more in the real economy again. And despite the pain and not hiding away from the fact that these crashes often do result in large human suffering, the other side in this deployment phase is where we see golden ages. So this is where the period of the automobiles, oil and mass production, this is where we saw the birth of the suburban American dream and lifestyle. We saw all these happy families living out in suburbia in America, and their lifestyle was underpinned by these new technologies being automobiles and oil. So we find ourselves in 2020 right in the middle, and Carlota Perez perhaps wishfully in 2002 thought that was the crash, and we perhaps may have been through this transition by now, but we're not, and she continues to say that we're not quite through it. But I'll skip ahead, sorry. The hope, and if we look to history, is that on the other side of the current predicament we find ourselves in is we'll see a new aspirational lifestyle with much greater wealth equality and prosperity generally, underwritten by the new digital technologies that we've spent the last 50 years figuring out and building. We already see green shoots in these lifestyles around the world, particularly in the young and the very wealthy. And so this looks like these dot points from one of Carlota Perez's talks here on the screen. So it's natural textiles versus synthetic, gourmet and organic foods, exercise and extreme sports, solar power as luxury and electric vehicles, anti-waste pro recycling, and sort of access over possessions. And this really all amounts to a new economy that's rooted in the service economy and the circular economy, or some combination of both. And what we need to move through this transition as well, one comment I didn't make earlier, is the first half of the technological revolution is generally characterized by marketized societies. So government is hands off and the market just gets to do its thing. Whereas the second half historically is very government led. And so you have a much stronger role of government in the market, creating policies and incentives to help bring about the society we want to live in, given these new technological tools that we have at our disposal. So I guess that's the question that we at Typehuman, given all of that, ponder is, what will be the technologies and behaviors that support this new aspirational life? And a lot of our work is working with individuals and businesses who share this same goal. One of the points I'll make a bit later, but I'll say it now, given I just started to say it, is the spoiler here is that despite our excitement around technology, one thing that we hold really closely is that over the long term, technology will no longer be a differentiator. Values and trust will be the ultimate differentiator, as more and more things are just commoditized by technology. So the businesses and organizations that thrive in this next phase will certainly be using technology, but they'll be doing it in a way that's very authentically orientated around serving the jobs and needs of their customers. So that's like our theory, the first half of what I was going to share. And I'll whiz through this next half so we can get onto the panel and not hold everyone up for too long. But there's certainly some technologies that we've been following. And as I alluded to, blockchain has been a big focus of ours over the last few years. And this is where you all get to a thumbs up or thumbs down again. Thumbs up if you've bought into the blockchain and you've probably own some Bitcoin, or thumbs down if you think it's just, it's bullshit, basically. Thumbs up, Nixon, thank you. Please be brave enough to do a thumbs down if you think it's bullshit. Nobody's brave enough. Cool. Well, the reason why we're so excited about blockchain hopefully will become obvious in a moment, but the short history of blockchain that we've seen so far is that it captured our imagination through Bitcoin. And then from there, we saw a new generation of innovators, of entrepreneurs who started wondering, well, what solutions and worlds could we build if we had this concept of digital scarcity? Before blockchain, anything that was digital could be quickly copied, and in some ways that was a feature, not a bug, of the early internet. But as we started to use the internet more and more in our business lives, digital scarcity became something really important, and particularly with money. We can't have a digital money unless we're confident that a coin can't be copied. And that was how Bitcoin really came to life. But that simple premise of digital scarcity has given rise to a whole bunch of new ideas and experiments. And we've seen a focus particularly on money, but also in identity and how we potentially prove our identities as we go through our life. We're seeing it applied in environmental conservation and health data, and broadly in data cooperatives in general. So data and money are the two spaces that we're seeing blockchain applied mostly, and probably most relevant to this for good conversation. So a couple of examples is some small work we did with Oxfam Australia was the Unblocked Cash project. So some of you might be aware that there's a large proportion of the global population that doesn't have access to a bank account. And right now there's aid is distributed to those in need, particularly after disasters, predominantly as goods and as assets, food and things like that. But there's a commitment to move from 7 to 20% of aid spend to be delivered to people in need via cash. And there's just a huge proportion of the population around the world that doesn't even have access to a bank account. So it becomes incredibly challenging to distribute cash to people in need when they need it. So as a leapfrog blockchain offers those populations a leapfrog technology to help people around the world have access to a bank account and receive payments when they need it. Oxfam Australia is doing some great work in Vanuatu alongside Melbourne startup Sempo to offer bank accounts and merchant facilities to people in Vanuatu. And then the idea is to roll this out across the Pacific so that cash can be delivered, particularly post-disaster, really quickly to those who need it. Identity is the next use case we're seeing a lot of work in blockchain, and where I've personally spent a lot of my time. Today, we sort of have limited options in how we solve the identity problem. There's over 1 billion people globally that don't have access to legal identity, which is probably more of a social and political problem than a technological one, but it's still a problem nonetheless. But blockchain provides us with an alternative to monopolies to help people prove who they are and perhaps what work qualifications and things like that they possess as they go through their life. And this is an interesting case because it's not that a platform monopoly couldn't solve this, but relying on a platform monopoly to do this job exposes us to the continued privacy concerns and abuses that we see today. So blockchain comes at a really interesting time if we want to have an alternative here. Second to last use case is another little project we're doing off the coast of Seattle in the US, which is helping citizen scientists coordinate orchid observations so that ships moving through a particular shipping route basically don't crash into the orcas because they're endangered, and apparently this happens quite a lot and it's fatal to the orca. The problem this is solving is a data coordination problem. You have several citizen scientist groups, all collecting data about these orcas, but reluctant to pull this data because of basically they've all been burnt in some way before when some group has come in and said, hey, can we pull all your data together? The data ends up being used for nefarious purposes, or the citizen science groups then get forgotten about and never really looked after. So the blockchain offers them with the ability to pull their data in a way that still gives them control over where it goes. And last but not least, and we're not really, the jury's out whether this will actually be a blockchain project or not, but it's a good example of how concepts of money is changing because of the experimentation that's happening in blockchain. The Banking for All Act in the US was passed recently, which is going to enable every US citizen to have access to a bank account, I believe, through USPS. And this is a bit like the Vanuatu example in terms of lack of access to bank accounts, but something that COVID has shown to governments around the world is if they want to deploy stimulus checks and payments to support people through these economic catastrophes, it's actually a really hard problem to do that. And so what we're seeing around the world now is central banks start to consider what's called a central bank digital currency. So again, the jury's out as to what technologies they're going to use to do that, but digital currencies are all the rage. Japan, China, US now are all adopting them. And this would allow our governments, or central banks more specifically, to have programmable money, distribute it to everybody. And my crazy sort of tinfoil hat sort of concept is this. I think this is going to give rise to a universal basic income over the next decade. And looping that back to Carlota Perez's work, and as a reminder that I don't think crazy ideas are off the table right now. We didn't have a welfare state before the Great Depression. We didn't have consumer finance and things like that before the Great Depression. So part of transitioning into this new golden age will come with new government infrastructure, new forms of finance to support this new aspirational lifestyle. And I don't think it's off the table that a universal basic income wouldn't necessarily be required for that new phase. So that's my quick presentation. A lot to fit into a little bit over 10 minutes in the end, I'm sorry. But yeah, the mark I'll leave is just this notion that despite us working heavily with technology at Typehuman, that we really fundamentally believe that values and trust are really the only competitive advantage, and technology is a tool to allow us to build our trust with our constituents and live up to our values. Over to you, Tom.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Nick. So stay there on the stage. We'll get the others up, and we'll move into the panel discussion. So I'm just going to do brief introductions, and then I'd love for kind of each of the three founders who'll be joining us to kind of share a couple of minutes about your company and the work that you're doing, the impact you're seeking. So let me bring you up one by one. Let's kick off with Lily Dempster, who's the founder and CEO of One Small Step, which is a fitness-style smartphone app that supports you to live an environmentally healthy life. Actually, I'll invite everyone up, and we'll kind of gather the panel, so to speak. It's a bit of a weird concept, I guess, in this format. But let me just identify everyone, and then I'll move through you to share a bit more about your work. Lucinda Hartley is the co-founder and CEO of Neighborlytics, a platform for on-demand data and insights into the quality of life and well-being of places. And Andrew Akib is the co-founder of Maslow for People, a voice-enabled assistant to support carer and rehabilitation management for young people with paralysis in their home. We're currently interacting with Andrew through the Future Makers Accelerator, which has been great. And also, full disclosure, I guess previously worked with Lily through the Dream Starter program with ING. So it's great to see you guys again. And Lucinda's done a lot of amazing stuff in the placemaking sector for a long time. So Lily, over to you to share just a little bit more about, I guess, how you're leveraging technology in the pursuit of social impact.
Yeah, sure. So hi, everybody. As Tom mentioned, I run an environmental enterprise, a profit for purpose company called One Small Step. And our mission is really to use behavioral science to make it easy and rewarding for people to reduce their personal carbon footprints. And we have a mobile app that's free to download. And it sort of works by, you're going to go in, you do a quiz, get a breakdown of your carbon footprint, a roadmap to become more sustainable. And we take into account things like your household setup and some of your preferences. And then there's a series of programs you can do in the app to reduce your personal footprint. But I think the innovative thing is sort of twofold with what we've tried to do. One is where it's sort of like Duolingo, if you guys are familiar with that app, language learning app, in that we're trying to break things down into sort of small bite-sized chunks to make it really easy for people to take action. And we're also doing a lot of what's called multivariate testing, although we're fairly rudimentary at the moment. We will get more sophisticated over time, where we kind of look at, well, what are the comms and design approaches that are going to be most effective in supporting people to take action? So my interest in this came from doing like stock standard political campaigning in climate change mitigation. And then I was running campaigns for Get Up. I was their former market impact director, and just kind of realized from some of our consumer campaigns the massive and very rapid impact you can have when you have a couple of thousand people with very high per person carbon footprints acting together to reduce those. And we saw that kind of play out in some of the campaigns I ran at Get Up. And then I was obsessed with behavioral economics and was like, oh, there's all this emerging research on how we support people to change their behavior, increase the uptake of pro-environmental behaviors. Let's put that into a user interface. And the fantastic thing about it being technology enabled is you can actually measure the results, and make changes based on certainly the self-reporting of users. But, there's an empirical basis to move forward in terms of figuring out what works. So it's been a hugely satisfying process. But that's where we're at now. Sorry, that was probably too long, Tom. You can just mute me if I go over.
That was great, thank you, Lily. Because I think there's an interesting piece there as well around how the leverage of behavioural science and big data as well that I think is going to be relevant to Lucinda as well. So maybe I'd ask you, Lucinda, to introduce yourself next.
Thanks, Tom, and great to see lots of familiar faces on this panel today or this evening. I'm coming to you from Melbourne on Wurundjeri country. If anyone else is in Melbourne, I can feel your pain right now. So Neighbourlytics is a social analytics platform that measures, probably in some ways not dissimilar to Lily, but looking at behavioural data to measure how neighbourhoods work. And we come at this problem from I'm an urban planner and come at this problem really from the objective that we want to see the places that we live in really be thriving and help us improve social well-being. But you don't have to look very far to see that cities and places aren't really working very well. And one of the challenges is that the people that make decisions about cities, property developers, governments, have very, very little information about communities and people. And in the same way that you would never expect a transport planner to create a traffic plan without any traffic data, we do expect every day that city makers will make decisions about neighbourhoods without any useful community intelligence. And so we harvest a whole range of digital interactions that people leave behind about the ways that they interact with their neighbourhood every day through platforms like Google Maps or event pages and ratings and reviews, and create social maps of places that help inform decision makers to be both more efficient, transparent, and kind of data-led in the way that they shape property and planning investment. So it's we're both criticised for being too social and not social enough, depending on which context you're in. So happy to unpack that tonight.
I think that's great. I'm currently listening to Jacqueline Novigratz's new book, The Founder of Acumen Fund, who's a real pioneer in
Yeah.
that blend. And she actually was talking about a similar dynamic. She said, sometimes when you're making everyone uncomfortable, you're on the right track. You're kind of
Okay.
finding the new way. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, would love to unpack that more a little later. Let's just bring our last member of the panel officially on the stage, which is Andrew Akib, the co-founder of Maslow for People.
Yeah, g'day, Tom. Yeah,
hello.
How you doing? Full disclosure, actually, close to a decade ago, I was part of kind of the Start Some Good community. So it is interesting to see how kind of the community folds in on itself and inspires people to go on and make change almost a decade later. But
so cool.
Yeah, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Maslow. And what we do is we make it as easy as possible for primarily young people that are suffering some sort of paralysis to manage their care and their rehab from home, which is where it matters most right now, as we see. And the way that we do that is we have a voice-enabled mobile app that lets them coordinate all of their carers, design and access all of their therapy and care routines, and communicate directly with specialists remotely from home. And for us, we started this because of the experience of a friend that suffered a traumatic brain injury. And what we saw is that he spent 9 months in rehab hospital, provided with a lot of structure, therapists by his bedside, nurses by his bedside, and specialists by his bedside. But when he was discharged home, he was left home with nothing but a folder to really interact with and figure out what he needed to do. He had to learn to manage a bunch of carers and teach them all of these things about managing this condition, which is incredibly hard. But we also saw when we engaged with the broader community and young people living with paralysis across Australia is that in particular in this cohort, technology was a huge enabler around accessibility and interaction. And we saw them at the cutting edge and the leading edge of using voice-enabled technology and alternative ways of interacting with products without a traditional user interface. So we tapped into that existing behavior in order to build out Maslow and get us to where we are today.
Oops, muted myself, sorry. There's every now and again screaming children run down the hallway behind me and barking dogs and the like. The situation we're all in, we're not all we have kids, you know what I mean, the jungle at home. But so excited to explore, there's so many different lines of inquiry, which is why I just want to encourage everyone again to please share questions in the chat. It'll help give all of us a sense of where you want us to take this. I'm very interested in kind of some meta issues around how we introduce innovation, how we find support for new things and so on. Some of the stuff that I was talking about in the intro. I'm sure people are also very interested in some of the specific trends around each of the areas that you're working in terms of smarter cities, how we address climate change and behavioral science. There's a whole really interesting trend, I think, around voice-enabled interfaces. But perhaps let's get started. I am also very interested always in what motivates and inspires people. And you've mentioned your experience with your friend for the traumatic brain injury. Andrew and Lily, you talked about kind of your experience, I guess, in traditional campaigning and Get Up in the climate movement, and which inspired you to kind of, I guess, think about new approaches to inspiring action. Lucinda, I was wondering kind of what were some of the experiences that I guess inspired you to go, we need to approach community development and placemaking in a really different way. Well, were there specific experiences you had that kind of were like, this has got to, I've got to do something about this, it's not good enough?
Definitely. And the short version is, I guess I'm a third culture kid, if you know what that means. I grew up in a culture that was different from the one around me and that of my parents. So I lived in many different countries, mostly in Kenya and Zimbabwe growing up. But I think I had from an early age this picture that where you live has this huge impact on your opportunities in life. And there's lots of research about that your postcode is actually as likely to affect your life expectancy as your genetics. And I became an urban planner because I was just really interested in cities and city issues, and thought that I would be able to play this role in shaping places for people, but actually found the reality of being an urban planner means spending years in front of a computer designing concrete joinery and other kinds of details, which I'm actually very good at. So if you ever go to the MCG, take a look at how wide the Wimco foam is, because that was my detailing work. But I found, that stuff is important because you don't want the concrete to crack, but I was really much more interested in the kind of meta systemic issues of why do we have such huge spatial inequalities, particularly in places like Australia. Australia, where we're investing billions in neighbourhoods every year, but still have massive inequalities of access. And when we really kind of looked into this problem, and I've been working in different ways of solving this problem, probably for 10 to 15 years now, like with United Nations, with grassroots not-for-profits. I ran a social enterprise that did place activation and neighbourhood improvement projects for almost a decade, and have now moved into data and tech. But the reason for that shift in particular is, you know, throughout all those different transitions, when we really looked at the problem, one of the issues was being able to quantify and measure the outcomes. And you mentioned that before, Tom, around impact measurement. But when it comes to a lot of I guess social sustainability or social well-being, it's quite invisible. And so when you're looking at neighborhood planning, you're able to quantify the numbers of apartments that you built, or the, you know, the number of cars coming through, or the trips that you saved by putting in bike lanes, which are great and really important things. But when it comes to social life, well-being, connection, these things that actually make our neighborhoods work, we don't really have very much information. And it's kind of the principle that you can't manage what you can't measure. And so Neighbourlytics operates on the premise that if we can quantify the social value of places in the same way that we can their physical value, then we can actually start to shift the dial in decision making. Because I don't think anyone's out there saying that they don't care about creating places with great social well-being. They just really don't know how to do it, because there's just not much evidence as to what makes it work.
Yeah, those are such interesting points. And I will make a point next when I next get to Melbourne and get to the MCG. I'm going to go check out your work. Satisfying that it shows up in public somewhere at the very least. Not everyone can point to specific contributions.
Also, made. The gates of the Flemington Racecourse.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
Just have a look at the
Been there
bluestone
once.
stacks.
Yeah, very cool. So I am interested in some of the topics, that I want to invite any of you to reflect on. What are some of the things that you've learned when it comes to, I guess, pitching new ideas to people? One of the key challenges, of course, with innovation is that not only can it not be measured yet, it can't be seen necessarily if it's something that hasn't existed before, if we really are like advancing into it in a new direction and taking new steps. And so at all stages of that process, that involves kind of, obviously getting people across that imaginative leap to where they understand what you're doing with enough clarity that they want to be part of it, whether that's as customers, partners, investors, colleagues, co-founders, or whatever the case might be. So I'd love to invite all of you, both in terms of your current work. I know many of you have been involved in previous startups before as well. Just what are some of the things you've learned about that particular challenge when you're kind of pre-launch and you're describing something that really doesn't exist yet? Who wants to go first?
I might pop in there and actually talk
great.
about experience from Maslow over the past, I guess, year and a half. But across 2019, we spent most of that time connecting with young Australians that had spinal cord injuries and trying to understand what the frustrations were for them with the system that we wanted to help change for them. And we actually started off, finding out a lot about these issues, such as carers not being trained and then being frustrated about the delivery of care, or therapists being unwilling to answer smaller health queries or address things on the spot. And when we initially learned that, we were quite frustrated by that, and we went to the system as antagonists. So we went towards kind of the clinical system, the healthcare system, the care system, and the rehab system with a little bit of like fire in our gloves to try and turn that around. But slowly, what we realized was that this wasn't the fault of the people that were in that system. And rather, we started empathizing with what were the actual limitations of why they weren't able to deliver a better system. Why won't they be able to deliver better care? Why weren't people incentivized to answer health queries remotely from home? And for us, the change in the lens from, I guess, antagonists to actually empathizing with what are the barriers that exist in this system, and not blaming, I guess, the people, as to be honest with you, when we came to the table initially, we felt like we had to, but rather giving them the tools to actually change the system. So I would say in terms of, well, this doesn't so much apply to the investment ecosystem or the business ecosystem, but rather the system that you're trying to change. When it comes to trying to influence change with that system, instead of coming, I guess, with a hot hand and a bit of anger in your heart, coming with a sense of empathy and really trying to put yourself in the shoes of the people that are operating that system and what their limitations are, and provide them easier ways to overcome those limitations, for us has been a strong catalyst of change. So an example we bring to the table is, last year, the conversations with therapists around remote healthcare were really, really difficult. You can imagine how those conversations have changed over the last few months as, you know, a lot of their clients and their paying clients have started not being able to turn up to the clinic where they've been begging for remote solutions. So I guess, yeah, changing from an antagonist mindset to a kind of empathetic mindset is very important to us.
That's great. Thanks, you, Andrew. That's a really interesting story because it's quite similar to us. Sorry, and then I'll continue this into just that when we started, we were frustrated about the lack of innovation. Like some of those dynamics we talked about were kind of annoyed at traditional funders. Like you guys are doing such a bad job of supporting innovation and you're so conservative and you're so not, you know, and then we realized actually there's a whole lot of natural pressures, particularly when you're allocating someone else's money to have to make justifiable decisions. And our job was to help them think through the pros and cons and de-risk that where we can. And now a lot of our work is in partnership with the kind of people who we originally kind of rejected as not helpful. And so I think that's a fascinating example. And I think that's not uncommon often when we're working in these spaces. And I mean, in a way, you're probably similar. I don't know if this is a useful segue for what you were going to say, Lucinda, but you're obviously, you know, there's obviously an inadequacy in the way that things have been done at the moment, but you have to partner with the people who are doing it inadequately in order to help them do it better if it's actually going to be done better in your world.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I found it really interesting, the point that you made in the introduction, Tom, around, I guess, social venture seen as high risk, which might be true, but any startup is extremely high risk. I mean, the success rate's very low.
Yeah.
And
totally.
I wonder, like, is it really that different? But
not really. I think it's just the mindset around risk.
Yeah,
part of it does come back to data, just to weave it in, because I think it's not just that you may not yet have data, but even that even down the track, it's not as easy to figure out if it worked. If you're an angel investor, everyone kind of gets what the equation is. You make 100 investments, 90% of them might fail completely. But as long as one of them is Airbnb, Facebook, Dropbox, or whatever, the whole portfolio works and is profitable, and often highly profitable. Whereas if you made 100 grants and 90% of them failed utterly and 9 of them were kind of okay, but one of them was like a profound breakthrough in a particular, you know, when it comes to placemaking, does that balance the portfolio? It's really hard to say.
Yeah, it's really tricky. But in terms of getting people over the line with innovation, I think it's really tricky. And I mean, I'm sure everyone on this panel would agree, like I modify the story completely depending on who I'm talking to. But the thing that we've probably tried to consistently do, and I don't know how conscious or unconscious it is, but they won't listen to us, but try to convince people that they will listen to. And so even sort of before we had customers, we got sort of beta free trials with big names. And so even though they weren't buying our product, it looked like we were backed by Lendlease and Frasers. And so that made them listen to us. And then they did become customers. And then we were able to go to others and go, look, these people are customers, you should listen to us too. And then we've done other things like collaborative kind of research projects with newspapers and things like that, which we don't get paid for, but then it's like the Financial Review has published exclusive research by Navalytics, and then that provides entry into government, and then they listen to us. And so it's sort of trying to like build this story trying to talk to the people that they will listen to until they listen to us.
That makes a lot of sense. It's very similar to what we teach people in crowdfunding as well, which is often you won't have the credibility, and that's fine. You can't just magic necessarily credibility, but you can borrow it from others if they're willing. And there's all sorts of ways you can do that. Which is why startups always have a few glamorous clients on their launch websites if they can at all help it. Nick, what about you? You've been through a few kind of, I think, cycles of pitching ideas, pretty innovative new ideas to people.
Yeah.
These days, you have to pitch the whole idea of innovation to people, I guess, similar to what I have to do. You have to kind of get people excited about the concept of innovation and then how you could help them generate that. What have you learned from those experiences?
Yeah. Some days I'm not sure whether I'm Dan Draper from Mad Men or, I don't know, some other sort of persona. Because, it feels like sometimes clients are bringing us in because they want us to pitch an idea to them that they can then take forward. But I think the general that I was sort of reflecting on was, I think the thing I'm looking for is the person you're talking to, like, is the problem a priority for them? Because if the problem's not a priority for them, then you're barking up a tree. So maybe one of the examples of that is we were supporting a financial services firm a few years ago to look at developing a financial literacy app for school kids. And it's pretty clear if you go and speak to a parent and ask them, are you interested in the financial literacy of your kid? They'll all say yes. But the reality of most parenting is that, as you know, Tom, they're time poor and it doesn't feature as a high priority for them in terms of all the problems that they need to think about day in, day out, or week in, week out. So I guess that's probably been the one differentiator to a successful pitch to an unsuccessful pitch is it's a numbers game. You're going to get a lot of no's before you get a yes. And I think once you find somebody that experiences the problem that you're looking to solve and it ranks highly in their order of priorities, then the rest of the process kind of becomes details. It comes about building trust and empathy and the things that Andrew's mentioned. But if you can't agree on what that problem is, then good luck. And perhaps the things I've seen more in the social entrepreneurial world is where people dig in. I think there's a lot of fire in the people that are in the social innovation space, and we like a good fight, and we try to convince people. We're often that's sort of wasted energy. But I'm going to go out on a limb and also say that I feel like a lot of maybe Tom, the scene's changed. I don't tend to follow it as closely, but say 5 years ago when I was following it more closely, there were a lot of people working in the social innovation space that perhaps was using their social cause to push a less superior product or offering. And they were sort of expecting that the world would give them their business because of the social cause, not because of the awesome solution that they had or the offering they had. And so I guess that's a cautionary tale that just because you do have that social cause, I don't think it's a justification to still be striving for a superior product or service on the other end.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Nick, and I totally agree. I think that's just a big shift that the whole sector has understood. Yeah. Increasingly, is that the product has to stand on its own 2 feet, or at least be on a par, I think. I mean, I do believe that you can kind of reach parity everywhere else and then use purpose can be how you compete competitors, but you can't be worse at all the other factors and hope to just make up the gap. Particularly if what we really want to do is shift the world in a serious way. I mean, I kind of think of this as social enterprise 1.0 and versus 2.0 a little bit. Like social enterprise 1.0 was the niche. There's been ethical consumers for a long time, and depending on which report you read, they were always kind of like 8 to 15% of the market, and they were the group of people who were willing to pay more, go out of their way, etc. But it's not going to really grow much beyond that. You're not going to get 85% of the population paying more, going out of their way, putting up with less. So if we are really serious about shifting things in this direction, then we do have to reach parity on all those things. I'm interested in your thoughts actually on this, Lily. If what we're thinking about is kind of broadly that leap into the mainstream as well. I guess that's kind of because it certainly feels like that is kind of what we're on the cusp of, with kind of, I guess, maybe more conscious consumption, some of those trends I was talking about in the intro. And in some ways you're part of, I think, a whole kind of category of startups around that are helping people identify the right choices, helping them navigate choices, helping people who want to live in alignment, assisting them to do that, making the barrier, making it that little bit easier, so you don't have to, put as much into doing the right thing. What are your thoughts, in terms of the behavioral economics and all the rest of it, on how we get more and more people to do the right thing?
Yeah, so I think like the really interesting thing is there's this spectrum, right? In terms of like, if we just use the example of people wanting to reduce their environmental impact, wanting to live in a more environmentally sustainable way, you have a spectrum of people in terms of their level of motivation, and then also how much they identify as, I'm an eco-conscious consumer, or I'm an environmentalist. And there are people kind of like really, really skilled and literate in the practice of sustainability, at a personal level, and they almost treat it like a hobby. And they're very interested in supporting kind of community initiatives in particular. So it's not just about their impact, it's about how do they grow the impact in their area. And then you kind of move a bit further back along the curve, and there's people who are sort of pretty interested, very guilt-laden. They kind of know what they should be doing, but they've sort of struggled to integrate it into their lives as consistently as they'd like. And then there's a group further back that is sort of just starting to understand, this is maybe something I want to look at, but I don't really know where to start and which of my actions really matter, and do they matter at all? So there's like a whole series of different kinds of people kind of along their sustainability journey. And then I guess like what I'd call the late majority of people maybe don't care that much or don't really engage with it. They have a whole series of other needs and concerns that take precedence, and that's completely understandable for many people. And I think for that group, one, I used to call the business, it's not a great name, but I called it the neighborhood effect. And that's actually a phenomenon in behavioral economics where your environment, your peer group, your physical environment really shapes your behavior very significantly, much more than we realize. So kind of our theory of change is really, let's focus on the people who, this is their value set. They actively want to reduce their footprints. They want to be sustainable, but they're struggling to kind of get there because ultimately we all need to get down to about 2 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. That's the UN's 2050 goal in terms of personal carbon footprint reduction. And at the moment, we're at about 17.5 tons per person on average in Australia. So, trying to get people down to that level, giving them really obvious ways to do it, tailoring the suggestions, positive reinforcement, using kind of social norms. We're kind of running a bunch of that stuff in our platform. And the theory of change is really, okay, well, if we get a critical mass of people doing that and there's some visible sustainable behaviors, that they're actually socially contagious. We already know that's the case with things like installation of rooftop solar. There was a massive study in California about a decade ago now that showed, people were installing rooftop solar on their roofs where their neighbors were. And this was irrespective of things like voter preference. So if you see people doing it, and we've seen it as well in Australia in terms of the virality of the zero waste movement, in particular influenced by the War on Waste program, but also because it's a visual indicator. You can see people, not as much now because of the pandemic, but we saw people kind of using keep cups a lot, using kind of canvas or reusable bags at the supermarkets. So there's a virality to sustainability. So that'll have an influence on the people who are less motivated, just unconsciously. But then for the sort of most resistant groups, the other thing is that resource efficiency, there's huge financial gain in reducing your energy usage, reducing the amount that you waste, learning to tap into gift and sharing economies in your communities, buying less stuff that you don't need. There's a huge financial incentive there. So there's a strong business case in terms of household finances, in terms of sustainability that's yet to be made, but that's sort of the last piece of it, I think.
Actually, we had a question in the chat, Lily, which this seems like a natural spot just to query about whether is it just for households and consumers, or is it also helping businesses figure out their footprint as well and how to reduce it?
Yeah, so the modelling required to do an accurate carbon footprint calculation for a business versus a household or an individual is completely different. So that's not something we're focusing on at the moment in terms of here's a carbon footprint for a business. We did do a pilot with Sydney Council in 2019 called the Better Buildings Cup, which was in about 100 companies. And that was more about the behavioral components of, how do you change your procurement policies? How do you do a co-assessment kind of rating? How do you look at your energy usage and, introduce a better waste management process? So we did that in partnership with Sydney Council and an initiative called City Switch. We're still waiting on the evaluation report. And frankly, I think, it's a really complex area to support businesses, because as you know, they're so heterogeneous. They have so many different requirements. If you're in a larger organization, the dynamics within the organization, the hierarchies, the decision makers you're dealing with, it's different from, a household unit where you're dealing with a couple of individuals at most. The group I can recommend to Nate, who asked the question, is Path Zero. So Simon Sheik of Future Soup is one of our investors. He and the former head of Australian Ethical, Phil Vernon, just supported this group called Path Zero. And they're a really kind of promising platform that do really good carbon footprint methodology assessments, carbon accounting for businesses of all sizes. And that's something I'd recommend you take a look at. Yeah.
Cool. That's great. Thank you. So, something with, we're thinking with, the topic here is thinking about kind of trends and where technology is going as well. And there's kind of an overarching trend that I've begun to worry a lot about recently, mostly because I read the book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontiers of Power by Shoshana Zuboff. And it's one of those books that is kind of like, you maybe only interact with periodically, that kind of recombines the puzzle pieces in your mind about what you're looking at when you look at the world around you and the economy. And to probably do a very bad job of summarizing it for those who are less familiar with the work. And it's essentially that there's a whole new form of capitalism, which is essentially based on data, but ultimately about surveillance, because the people who get to control and make the key decisions are, of course, not those who have been, the data is being collected from, but rather those who are doing the collecting. And that this has kind of shifted our vision of many of the, and this is, you know, things like assistance in all sorts of contexts, like Maslow now, but that whole category was once considered was once conceived of as a closed loop between the, you know, the device or the app that was collecting the data, and then the person who's generating the data, also the owner of the data. Now, of course, it's a loop that is largely invisible to us, that goes to the companies. And so I'm just interested in all of you, because data's kind of come up with kind of all of you guys in different ways. That I'm just interested if this is something you're thinking about, if this is what is a line you think about in terms of your own business in leveraging data for good. But there must be, I think, an abundant temptation today to monetize that data in ways that could sure support you to be sustainable and to do your mission in the short term, but which maybe would fit into this broader trend that is concerning, even if your specific use of data or the data or your motivation to collect that data is, you know, completely moral and ethical in terms of your perspective in the short term. Not sure if that came out as a completely coherent sentence, but if that resonated with any of you, I'd love your thoughts on this, because it's something I'm thinking a lot about.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'll just jump in, but
yeah,
my nightmare is probably, you know, the data we have on our users, and, you know, what's going to make them, you know, most likely to take on a particular program of action and then reduce their emissions in a certain area. That data being sold to a company to market products to them that they don't need. You know, like that's a nightmare scenario for us, and it's sort of anathema to what we're doing. You know, the way that I've tried to, you know, because it's a question that came up early on for me, frankly, you know, when we were just getting started, you know, going through an accelerator program put in front of a lot of different you know, people and potential investors. And the question was, well, how are you going to monetize? You're going to sell the data. You know, that was a kind of almost like a go-to for a lot of the people we spoke with. And, you know, for us, like the answer is no. And we'll, like, our focus is, you know, the things that we're trying to do to bring in revenue are, you know, a subscription service or like a premium version, but a lot of the content, you know, we're keeping free. Enterprise partnerships, so, you know, creating a version of the app for enterprises that want to offer it to their sort of staff or residents or employee, you know, customers, and then maybe also some affiliate marketing, but kind of at arm's length, where we do, you know, non-exclusive recommendations on products and say, here's the sponsored one, we get a you know, a fee, but there's all these other options that we think are good also. And that's kind of, that passes the integrity test for me. Yeah, and we've got you know, a social enterprise constitution where there's, the director's duties require us to advance the environmental objectives of the business. So, you know, I think if we were making money not doing that, like, and it was counter to our mission, then that would actually be a breach of our director's duties. So that's kind of how I've tried to manage it.
Andrew, I'm really interested in how you guys are thinking about this, because obviously as a voice assistant, you essentially kind of collect people's thoughts, needs, and all sorts of, you know, pretty personal data about the person who's interacting with that voice assistant. And I'm just kind of interested in how you guys think about, I guess, how best to manage that data in a way that is congruous with your mission and values.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. To be honest, it's something that keeps us up at night very, very often. However, something that Lily pointed out is it's really important to, it's really easy to be influenced by some of the easy outs and some of the easy business models that exist around data monetization. That's something that has worked before, and it's something that many people expect you to do over and over again. But what actually happens is when you do when you do kind of really establish what your values are, and you really establish what your morals are, and really understand how engaging with that may conflict with them, what happens is when you close the door on that, you open yourself up to alternative business models. So exactly how Lily demonstrated, by closing the door to the kind of data monetization at scale business model, it meant that they had to think harder and harder about what were going to be the business models for sustainability that caused them not necessarily to open the door around mass data monetization that's outside of the user and as outside of the business's control. Something that we really believe in, and one of the things that we're really focusing on Maslow, is data democratization that is back in the user's hands. So yes, it's very easy to open that loop back up to those that are going to benefit from it. And it may seem very, very tempting, but it's always important to go back to your visions and back to your values. And for us, that's, the customer first, and that's about being human first, and that's about having data transparency for the user, and ultimately the user being in control of their data. As soon as we breach that for ourselves, then we've steered away from our vision, we've steered away from our values. So for us, yes, we've had a lot of really difficult decisions, many of which were going through accelerator programs when we were having conversations with investors that looked at the data monetization aspect of it. But by closing the door to that, it opened us up to alternative business models that focused on the consumer being the economic buyer and the controller of their data.
I love that idea that if you just, that if you're kind of resolute with your values and close the door, it just forces you to be more creative and to find something that's a better fit rather than taking that easy out. That's great. We're running short time. Nick and Lucinda, I don't know if that's as germane a question for you. Lucinda, you're more aggregating data that already exists rather than generating new data in the same way, I think. But I'd be interested in your thoughts.
We are, but the questions that we often get asked, because we work with behavioral data, so it's generated at some point by a human, but it's many, many levels aggregated by the time that we get it. But we really call it place data rather than personal data, because what we're really trying to understand is place performance through the lens of behavior based on like dwell time or interactions, or it's the kind of information that you might see from Google traffic, for example, around aggregating cell phones to understand critical mass at different times, opening hours, check-ins, likes. And it is something that we nevertheless think about, but we, I guess, don't have any personal data. So it's not that we aggregate it and anonymize it. It's already anonymized. It's just a statistic when we get it. But there is, as we move forward, obviously if we're trying to understand neighborhoods in more depth, we are continually adding new data feeds in and thinking critically about the useful handling of that data.
There's a couple of, this seems like a good moment before we run out of time to introduce it. There's a couple of interesting questions that came up when you first introduced what you were doing, Lucinda, which is first, how do you even define a neighborhood? You kind of talk about your data at a neighborhood level, not at an individual level, but how do you define what is a neighborhood from your point of view? And then the second one is just quickly, what are kind of, if you had to pick, and you obviously have a huge smorgasbord, and I bet you get asked this question all the time, just like I get asked what are my favorite ever crowdfunding campaigns. But what are your favorite data points, essentially? Like, what's the kind of, if you had two key indicators, if you only knew two data points about a neighborhood that would indicate kind of a thriving, successful, connected neighborhood, what would those kind of two core indicators be?
It's a tricky one. A neighborhood we define as a walking distance catchment, which just we standardize to a 1 kilometer radius, which is about a 20-minute walk.
Right.
And that's very consistent with human behavior. It's very different from how we typically measure place, which is by postcode or political boundary, but that's like Smith Street in Collingwood, if you know it, like one side is in one municipality and the other side is in another municipality.
It's like King Street in Sydney.
As one street. So the radius is much more reflective of behavior, because then we can choose where we put it. In terms of the attributes, I mean, overall, the things that we look at is like ampleness and diversity. So does it have enough opportunity for things like work, social connection, parks, services, etc.? And the second thing we look at is diversity of opportunity. So is it all just one type of job, or are there many different types of employment? And more resilient neighborhoods will have greater levels of access. But the favorite things that I have that within the different indicators that we look at, that I really like is that by using the behavioral data, you can measure things like opportunities for social connection and activity, not just sort of what's there. And so to me, great neighborhoods are all about the people. So you really want to understand what your opportunities to connect with family and friends and connect with strangers are, as much as you want to know that there are great parks and libraries. That's
great. That's so interesting. Thank you. We're basically out of time. I had two questions I wanted to ask you, so I'm just going to combine them and ask if you could, and maybe if we could go, around the circle, and if you could go do kind of rapid fire responses to these two, probably far too big in scope questions. But just in your space, this is about the future. So in your specific kind of area, what's your vision for how you hope that has played out 3 to 5 years from now? kind of a generation approximately, I think, in technology these days, about a half decade. And then I'm also curious for each of you, what's a completely different technology that you're really excited about or keeping an eye on? Not one that is relevant to your business directly, but that you think is really cool and that you personally are kind of keeping an eye on or jazzed about. And if there is one, of course. Happy for anyone to go first. Who wants to jump in?
I haven't spoken for a while, so happy to take one for the team.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So for us in 3 to 5 years, so we're effectively, a people business. So speculating 3 to 5 years, we'll see greater affordances to gig workers. So I think we'll be able to ethically engage more with contractors, knowing that there's some sort of structural safety net for them. It's probably something I'll go out on a limb on. And in terms of novel technology, where I'm following CRISPR quite closely at the moment. So I don't know what that acronym spells out.
Gene editing, is that right?
That's right. So yeah, we can edit genes now programmatically, and theoretically that could lead to like the end of aging, or certainly, that's where the Silicon Valley elites are taking it. But right now it's really being applied more in, genetic diseases.
That's so cool. That could be the last frontier in inequality, of course. Like we all say, that the only things that are certain for all of us is death and taxes. We know taxes are true, and if death is no longer even something that is equal for all of us,
the zeitgeist is certainly shifting. The zeitgeist is certainly challenging whether death has to be.
I suspect it's we're a long way short of equal access to this death-defying technology, but that could be an interesting challenge. That could raise the pressure on some of that stuff. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Cool. That's really interesting. Who would like to go next? There's some final thoughts on these trends.
Yeah, I can if you can still hear me, because my headphones are about to die.
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, I mean, from an analytics perspective, we're interested in making like social prosperity the fundamental kind of tenet of investment and strategy, particularly for cities, but that has a lot of relevance for other verticals as well. And now in the tail end during COVID, I mean, to me, everyone's talking about building back better, but I think there's never been a more important time to really put people-centered design well-being at the center of that conversation. So it's actually quite exciting to think about that. We follow lots of different kind of AI and machine learning trends because we're an analytics company. But the thing, I guess, from the data side that interests me most is probably what's going to come online with IoT data. Because that's very behavioral data. It has a lot of more risks, I think, than some of the other passively created data, because it's like beacons and other things. But I think there is enormous opportunity used well to for good intelligence with that.
Cool. Thank you, Lucinda. Lily, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So 5 years from now, like our ultimate goal is to be a massive consumer tech product. So we're looking at, global presence. If we know that if we had sort of the same number of active users as Fitbit, and those active users, there's about 28 million, if they got through like a third of their carbon footprint reduction, so six tons each, then the carbon emission reduction is equivalent to about shutting down 40 coal-fired power stations. Australia has about 25. So, that's just to kind of put it in perspective in terms of, mass level carbon footprint reduction is really significant. So that's our ultimate kind of goal. It's aspirational. In terms of technology that I think is interesting, it's not particularly well advanced in terms of performance, but there's so many areas in climate change where we have the technology, and it's just about scale and distribution and the political intransigence in many places. One area where we do need technological advance is in jet fuel. So the use of and experimentation with synthetic gas as a replacement for jet fuel is a super interesting area that I care about, but it's not looking super hopeful yet.
I really want that as someone who loves to travel and would love to do that.
Yeah, it's less relevant now, but
no, exactly.
Pandemic, but
yeah, but in the future, I aspire to go to new places again one day. Cool, thank you so much. And then Andrew.
Yeah, I think for us, kind of a 5-year vision we really want to see come to life is truly patient-centric healthcare. So healthcare that's undermined and built around the patient or the client, as opposed to us necessarily being at the mercy of the legacies of the healthcare system. And for that to be enabled in home, so that healthcare is something that becomes a norm all the time, as opposed to something that coincides with a doctor's visit or engagement. A little bit kind of a left of field technological advancement, but there's quite a lot of research going into neurostimulation for spinal cord injuries and other kind of nerve and neuro injuries. And they're seeing quite a lot of promise in terms of the ability for people to regain feeling, regain movement in limbs that have been otherwise paralyzed. That's something that we'd really like to see continue to be experimented with, continue to be pushed, and continue to be supported to get an outcome so that people can, regain the ability to walk for those that have been paralyzed.
That's so cool. That's so exciting. Thank you, guys. That was such a great snapshot on both where you see that you guys are going in terms of your company, your work, your industry, as well as some really tantalizing kind of technological trends that I'm sure some of us haven't thought at all about, but which are so interesting and so exciting. So we're past time. I want to expect it's evening, depending on your time zone. Can be a bit of a busy time for many. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much to the panel. Your ideas and insights are so valuable and so interesting. Andrew, Lily, Lucinda, and Nick, thank you all so much. Really great to see you, and for everyone who joined us. I also just want to thank again our partner who has supported this series, the Community Bank at Darling Square, the Darling Square Community Bank, which is part of the Bendigo Adelaide branch network. So as a community bank, they're a profit for purpose enterprise, with up to 80% of their profits are returned into the local community through community funding and community initiatives like this, I guess, will be part of that. So very grateful for that, and acknowledging that. Thank you for turning up, Raymond, who's the chair of the bank as well. So anyone who is lives, visits, is active around that part of the world, you should certainly check out the community bank. You'll get some additional follow-up communication from us, no doubt. Future events coming up. We've already announced the next topic for Think Act Change, which is on collaboration over competition, the benefits of coming together. So we've got some really interesting examples of collaboration is hard, much like innovation, but when it works, it can really unlock some incredible possibilities. So we'll be exploring both the hardness and how to unlock those possibilities in that conversation. I'd love you to join us again. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening and rest of the week.